Alright class, today we're going to do section 1.2, which involves transformations of linear and absolute value functions. Just as a reminder, a linear function, basic parent function is y equals x, and an absolute value function is y equals the absolute value of x. But for this section, you really need to think like an artist. Like, we are talking about algebraic functions, but we're thinking about them visually. So you need to remember where your positive and negative x's are, where your positive and negative y's are. Now we're going to do transformations. So we're going to move things up and down, left and right, and we're going to start flipping things or reflecting them about different axes. So something you need to know and copy down in your notes. If we're moving up, down, or have anything to do with the y-axis, that's vertical, up and down, we're going to put them outside parentheses, away from the x. So it's going to be an A, or it's going to be out back plus k. Likewise, you can see it over here. If it's anything to do with the x-axis, that means left and right, or horizontally stretched or shrunk, that's going to go in the parentheses with the x. Now we still do some math to make sure it looks nice algebraically, but you start in the parentheses with the x or inside the absolute value sign. So if it has anything to do with the x, it goes with the x. If it has anything to do with the y, vertical, it goes outside, front or back. So here's some examples. We are on page 13 doing numbers 1 through 4. Number 1 tells us that y equals 3x, and we want to translate 5 units up. All right, so we need to write a new equation. If we're moving up, that's a plus to go to the positive numbers, and it's going to be out back. So up or down, that goes right here with the k. Up or down. And that's your answer. This will give you 3x moved up 5 units. We'll graph it later. Number 2. The question is y equals the absolute value of x and then minus 3. And we want to translate it 4 units to the right. All right, so right is horizontal. That goes with the x because the x-axis is horizontal. The problem with the x is that you need to do everything opposite. So if it tells us to do 4 units to the right, and to the right are the positive numbers, we need to do the opposite of that and actually take away 4. So our answer is going to be y equals the absolute value of x minus 4, and then we never touched that minus 3. That's the y, it actually is up, or it's down 3. So again, here's our parent function, or the question function rather, not the parent function. The book tells us to translate 4 units to the right. If it's an x, it goes with the x. If it's an x, you have to do the opposite. So if we want to go to the positive numbers, we need to write a negative number. Give me a second while I erase. And I'll do 3 and 4 for you. We'll do extra examples in class. Obviously, make sure you're taking down notes right now, especially tricks to remember the craziness about the x-axis. All right, number 3. The question is y equals negative the absolute value of x plus 2 minus 1. And it's telling us to reflect it in the x-axis. All right, this is really weird, but we want to reflect it in the x-axis, so that means we want to flip it up and down. We're going to rotate about the x-axis. That's our pivot point. So if it's up, we want to flip it down. If it's down, we want to flip it up. So what we do to do that for reflections is we change all the signs that are outside the parentheses. So if it's negative, we make it positive. If it's negative, we make it positive. And by graphing, you'll see that this was a downward absolute value function. This will be an upward absolute value function, and they'll look rotated. You have to believe me on that until we graph. So again, if we're reflecting in the x-axis, we want to change the y's. The y's are outside the parentheses. So this was -1, it became +1. This was -1, and it became +1. All the signs change for the y's when you reflect in the x-axis. Likewise, for number 4, it tells us to reflect in the y-axis. So y is going to be our pivot point, kind of like the hinge on a door, where the doors rotate horizontally. Y equals 1/2 x plus 1. So now it's telling us to reflect in the y-axis, and if we're reflecting in the y-axis, we're moving it like this around the y-axis. So that means we're actually changing the x's. And when we want to change just the x's, reflect in the y-axis, you only change the sign next to the x. So if you're changing the sign on the y-axis because you're reflecting in the x-axis, you change all the signs. If it says to reflect in the y-axis, like number 4 does, where you're flipping it horizontally around the y-axis, you change just the sign in front of the x. All right, make sure you take good notes on that. We'll talk more about it tomorrow.